Hi, welcome to Noise Violation Podcast. Today, our guest is Cy Wakeman. She's the author of her new book, No Ego, and the host of the podcast, No Ego. Welcome to the show, Cy.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, so tell us about yourself and how you got going with the podcast. I know you've been a writer for a long time. You got a couple other books. So what, I guess, would you say your specialty is psychology?
You know, my background, my actual training is in social work. And so a lot about human behavior. Psychology narrows in more on the functioning of the mind, the brain, where social work also brings in all of those system pieces about how skillfully one walks through the world.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so where'd you grow up? What school did you go to? Did you get a degree?
All that good stuff. Well, I grew up in a little tiny town in Iowa called Belmont. I think when I was there, it was about 800 people. So I grew up in this really cool community, good people. We had, kind of small classes and just, teachers that were very interested in us and so much opportunity to participate in so many events. When I would meet people from bigger schools and I would say, yeah, I played basketball, I was in track, I was in drama, I was in band. They were like, no way. So grew up very eclectic, but I was the first of my family to go on to college. I started at Drake University in Des Moines, and I studied international relations and political science and third world economic development. My heart was such that I just really wanted to go in the Peace Corps and work with women and micro lending, and which is kind of funny because hopefully my life's coming full circle where I'll be able to do some of that. But I got involved in helping people, and at that time helping people in recovery populations. I became really interested in upping my skills. So I got a second degree in social work. And then because I worked in healthcare, I went on and got a master's in healthcare administration. So I worked as a counselor, and then I was promoted into leadership. And one of the reasons I took the leadership role is I actually had grown a little tired of the one-on-one and group counseling, because what I did basically every day, all day long, is I taught people how their mind works so they quit getting played by their ego. And I taught people how the world works because everybody's kind of in this major argument with reality. Like they just, instead of accepting reality, they want it different or in their favor. And so I thought, well, I'll go into leadership and then I won't be doing kind of this over and over and over again.
Was it the same type of people? Was it, you said it was addicts or recovery?
Yeah, so I was working in recovery in my 20s when I was a counselor. And so going into leadership, I was going into lead in healthcare, so nurses and physicians and techs. But what was so funny is that whether you're in recovery or out of recovery, whether you are a patient or an employee, there's this basic body of knowledge that most of us don't get unless we've had experiences that really bring us to our knees and really shape us. And if you haven't had those experiences, you miss out on really understanding like how your mind works and how the world works.
And do we need that experience, or can that be taught without a big experience?
I think that we don't need a big traumatic experience, although many of us have them. They're just unprocessed, right? I don't think we need the traumatic experience. I think that's what like naturally brings people in to go, wait a minute, my way's not working. But I do think we have to mine the experiences we have for like, what's my part in this? What's the red thread? Like, what's the kind of theme of my life here of, really looking at not just focusing on purpose. Like so many people, when they get into personal development, they're like, I want to figure out my purpose in the world so I can go out and impact the world. And
Mm-hmm.
especially right now, I have 4 sons under the age of 30, and it's all about like, how can I hustle and impact the world? And what we forget is while we're out impacting the world, we have to allow, and this isn't passive, it's an act of allowing, we have to allow the world to impact us. So we go out with impact, and which is awesome. It's bringing our gifts to the table. But if we don't allow ourselves to be impacted by the world, it gets to be just ego and I know and self-serving. And I think that we have to get people, if they want really meaningful lives, to, especially what's going on today, to be impacted, not traumatized, but to use each other to help make sense of our world and how can I be grown by the world and shown where my next piece of ego work is or my next piece of evolution is. I really want people to stop developing so they can get more, attain more, and do more, and instead evolve so that they can play a greater role in the work that we've got to do to create a better workplace and workplace.
So allowing that the world or seeing the world, and do you kind of have to pause and look around? Is that more self-awareness or like awareness? I guess, how do you gain that?
How do you gain that? The biggest thing is, I think there's 2 things. One, I think you have to really question your thinking. Like you got to you have to stop believing everything you think. So what so many people do is they believe if they thought it, that it's true, like that they are observing something and thinking truth. And that's just not how the mind works. You are always being played by your ego. There is always a narration going on. It's almost like just because you move the dial on your radio to another channel doesn't mean that that signal that was there goes away. You're just not tuned into it. There's always thinking going on. And most people don't know that they aren't the thinker, they're the observer of the thinking. So when they think something, they just believe it. So if I'm driving along and somebody moves into my lane, allowing less room than I prefer, which is all that happened.
Yeah.
I think that a-hole tried to kill me.
Is that the ego?
That's ego. That's
ego
total ego.
saying that guy's the a-hole?
Yeah. I never question, is that what really happened? My ego named it. And once I name something, I'm no longer curious about my reaction or about different ways I could respond. So the minute I name it, that guy is, a disrespectful person and arrogant and, trying to kill us. Once I add on to reality, I add on my own form of stress, because reality isn't what is stressful. Our story about reality is what's stressful. So if I ask myself, if I just go, wait a minute, my ego just gave me a thought. My superpower is I can question my thinking, and especially if it's stressful, and see if it's true. And so I'm like, what do I know for sure? Well, he did this crap on purpose. It's like,
Right. I heard you
know?
in a podcast, you say usually people go to like the worst case scenario, or that they always jump to bad conclusions, maybe instead of like giving people the benefit of the doubt or giving them space. Like maybe that guy was rushing his wife to the hospital or something, and his wife was having a baby or something.
Yeah, and that's one technique, because we assign negative intent. When the ego's in charge, your data is always corrupted, because you're only bringing in data to the most primitive part of your brain. And it's usually assigning negative intent, because the ego's role is protection. It's to see insult even if there isn't any. So one technique is to think, give him benefit of the doubt. Maybe he didn't see me, or maybe, he's rushing his wife to the hospital. That is a beginner's step, because that can turn into some like bypassing spiritual bypassing or like Pollyanna thinking is better than the alternative. But true freedom comes when you realize how little you know.
Mm-hmm.
All you know is that he moved into your lane, and the reason you were so chafed by it is your preference. You prefer more space between cars than he allowed. And if you get down to like, what do you know for sure? Then helping is so much easier, because it's like, if that's all that happened, what could I do that would be helpful? Like, how can I give a little today? I can just slow down and let the guy in. I'm peaceful, they're peaceful, we're all okay. And I see so often that people just believe whatever they think. And so that's the one thing that I think we really have to get clear about, is stop believing everything that we think. And then the other piece is really the self-reflection, not just in the moment, like, is this true? But the self-reflection and the practice disconnecting, whether it's meditation or, so that we can move out of our ego and our external focus and into our body and our heart. And, you know, I can tell how wise someone is. Wisdom happens by this self-reflection on the inside. I can tell how wise someone is by how much love they walk through the world with, meaning like how peaceful they are, because they're connected. Internal evolution leads to wisdom, so that externally you can move through the world more skillfully, and you're less dependent on the world. I meet so many people and they're like, well, it's my boss's job to engage me, and it's my boss's job to make sure I feel psychologically safe at work. And I'm like, then you're a prisoner, because you have put your psychological safety in the hands of an external human who's bound to screw this up, but only daily. What if you could, what if you could make your psychological safety portable? Like, what if, and hopefully you work for people that don't work hard to mess with you, but life's messy. And I think so many of us go out to have impact, and we first meet any messiness, and then we either go, well, I have to wait until the messiness goes away, or I have to push harder, I've got to hustle more. And what we're not recognizing is there's a whole different way to move through the world. And so, that I would say you've got to take time for reflection, but in that reflection, you can't reflect on what happened to you. You've got to reflect on how your ego played you.
And to stick on ego for a little bit, when people talk about it, it's always talked about like, if somebody has a big ego, it's always a negative thing. Is there any way like an ego is positive, or like, does it do any good?
Oh yeah.
What are the benefits of an ego? Or,
you know, people, my book is called No Ego. So people are like, oh, so you want to get rid of your ego. And first thing I say is good luck, right?
Yeah.
You know, like some people supposedly have, like Buddha transcended and was sitting under a tree and disappeared. Like, I think some people have really moved beyond ego. The rest of us, we have this human condition where we have ego, and ego does serve us. It's all about preservation. And especially as we're younger, it, you know, it teaches us boundaries, and it can get us to do some things that, you know, for our own survival that we might not do. It can, you know, really let you know when something is very violating, when you're kind of affronted by something. So it's good information, but it's just that, it's like one data point. And so there's goodness to it, but we overuse it. It's really the most primitive part of our brain. It brings in corrupted data. It's like wearing a pair of prescription glasses with the wrong prescription, and we scan the world with it, and it brings it into like the most primitive part of our brain. It's like, if we think of computers, it's like such a limited processor. It's binary. It's like fight or flight, or people please or confront. Like, it only has like a few levers. It's like trying to play Fortnite, you know, with a thumb and a tiny little joystick. Like, you got nothing. It's like, And so what is interesting to me with so many of the people I work with is they insist on the best technology. Like I have a perfectly fine iWatch and I'm itching because one came out yesterday. I'm like, I don't need it, but it kind of bugs me that I don't have like the best.
Right.
And yet inside their own brain, they use the most primitive part and to go through the world. It's very ironic to me that our ego controls us to the point that it's our ego that gets hooked on social media. It's our ego that then can get played to it, even in social media, where we go down the rabbit hole and then our feed is crafted to isolate us into a singular viewpoint with very little options. We become unaware that anyone could possibly think different than we are. And we live this very polarized life. And we're living it politically right now. That's all ego stuff. But
Right.
I would tell you, it's even more miserable when most people live a polarized life on a daily basis, because then your spouse isn't, if you choose to marry, your spouse isn't a human being that comes with their own filters and has this whole spectrum of ways they interact with you. They become just the one who always jumps to conclusions. And now the experience of your relationship is so limited because your spouse either likes you or judges you. There's like nothing in between. And then people are like, why isn't my life feel fulfilling? Why isn't it enriching? It's like, well, you're living under the view of ego, and you have gotten rid of 99% of life because you wanted to focus on this thing that felt good. So for instance, when something happens in your life, if it's negative, we instantly name it and we're like, not grateful for it, resist it, not let it in. And we're so short-sighted, we're judging that as like right now, instead of getting curious and allowing it in and go, well, this is certainly a plot twist. If I say neutral, I can co-create with this, and I'm in a space where I'm just in that creative zone. If you're creative, the zone where you sit and wait, and court the muse. In our life, we can't live creative lives unless we're willing to sit and kind of court the muse. And what happens, I believe, is it's all okay in the end, or it's not the end. So if you're in a place where something has entered your life that just isn't yet to your favor, you haven't been with it long enough. Because I'm older, I'm 55, and as I look back on life, there were key turning points that it wasn't just about thinking positively, it was about dancing with them long enough so I could see how this thing played out, and it played out pretty incredible. One year I was asked to go to Australia and kind of all expenses paid for a year, work with a company there, and they would move my family, and we rented our house to some friends. I shut down my consulting business. Like, it was going to be amazing.
Right.
And about 3 weeks before we were to move there, the company got sold, and they called me and they're like, Cy, the deal's off.
Oh,
and I'm like, what? And I wanted to just rage against the world. I was just convinced, like, no matter how hard I work, nothing ever turns out. And I used it to reinforce, like, self-judgment, which is also ego. Like, I'm a fraud, and, I can't trust anybody. The ego gives you only a few choices: trust or everybody, or trust nobody. Well, as I just found a way to be with that, I started to notice that how the universe does always work in my favor if I'm allowing. A couple of months after that, my mom and my sister were diagnosed with breast cancer. And had I been on that contract in Australia, I would not have even been allowed to come home and visit. Like, I would have had been there a year. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I could be here to help them. But then I got sacred time. Like, I was able to be with my mom before she died in sacred ways, which has allowed me then to be there for dear friends as they're passing in sacred ways. So what seemed like disastrous in my 20s was the very thing I believe the universe was bringing to me to evolve me. And I didn't need to learn more about success. I've been very successful many times in my life. I needed to learn about holding space while people complete their lives. And I learned that in my 20s. And that has been such a theme in my life, such a number one skill where people can really count on me to just be present with their dying, whatever choices they make, to be non-judgmental, holding space, loving them up as they complete the last years of their life. I would have not had that evolution if I had stayed rageful about a missed external opportunity. And that's really what I mean by staying curious, and don't name something a failure too soon.
Right. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear about the cancer struggles of your family.
Well, thank you.
But it also reminds me of what you're saying on one of your podcasts about staying neutral, is not attaching something as great or terrible. Just stay neutral and kind of live in the moment and see what happens. And so that kind of reminded me of that too.
Very much so. I think that whenever we shift out of neutral, we're pretty certainly in ego because we're reacting to something external. Now, pain happens. So like when my mom passed away, I mean, that was really painful on a visceral level, just that pining for somebody you love. But the suffering part is the optional part. So my mom passed, and it's been years, but every once in a while I still have a flood of feelings. And with feelings, all you need to do is breathe and allow. And, it's an emotional process that just needs to move its way through you and your life. But what we tend to do is attach intellect to our feelings, like we think our feelings. If we're feeling anxious right now in the pandemic, we attach a thought, like, instead of just being like, I'm really anxious, there's a lot coming at me I haven't seen before. I'm
right.
just anxious.
If that guy cuts you off and then you're angry, do you stay angry like all day? Are you going to let it ruin your whole day? Or are you just going to be angry for that 5 seconds and then just get over it?
And even deeper, underneath that anger, which is usually an ego response, sometimes healthy, sometimes not, is fear. The real thing you were feeling is fear. It's just like if you have kids and you see one of them almost get hurt, what you're feeling is fear, but what you respond to them, wouldn't it be great as a parent to go, oh, sweetheart, let me hold you. I just saw how easy it would be to hold or to lose you. And oh, mom was so scared by that because I love you so much and I'm so grateful. Let's really make the most of this moment. We don't act out of what's really happening. We are scared and then we're mad. And the kid we almost lost that just passed, before our eyes, we yell at because we're like, don't ever go on the street again. As if that's the only moment we can teach them about streets. That's ego. If you're beyond ego, you're just in touch with what you're feeling and you share that. You love that child up. And then in a less emotional time, you go, one of the things as we reflect about today, we had kind of a close call and it had to do with streets. And so what do you know about streets? And what do you know, what would be a good idea that you already know about streets? Like parents, we feel like we have to teach people something. That's us having impact in the world. Instead of us being impacted, and one of the most profound lessons you can do is before you set a rule or teach a kid anything, is ask them like, what were you born with? Like, what's your karmic and generational wisdom about metal objects moving quickly on like cement roads? Like, what you got anything in there? Because me teaching you is still an external experience you will need to test. Me asking you to call up wisdom you have or you can discern, you're asking you, and it's wisdom you can trust. And so from early on, we teach people like to trust external more than internal. And, my hope for everybody is we start teaching people to trust themselves internally, but not trusting their ego, trusting something deeper and bigger, their internal wisdom.
Yeah, and I think that's something that the education system has completely missed as we're studying books or memorizing facts or memorizing dates, whereas all that stuff we can Google now is like all that information's at our fingertips. So if we really want to know, when the Constitution was signed, I can ask Siri or something, but we're not taught how to think. We're not taught how to use our body. We're not taught how to be healthy. So I think, that's something that is really missing in today's world as we're teaching young kids and young men, which also leads me to kind of my next point or next question or topic. You're an expert on entitlement, and kind of my generation has been labeled as entitled. Where do you think that comes from, or what's the root of that entitlement, or what is entitlement? Can you explain a little more about that?
Yeah. So first of all, I think that anytime we move into like naming and labeling a generation, all we're labeling is our limited experience of that generation. Again, it's a naming from an ego perspective, but entitlement is it's a temporary condition, but here's how it's created is engagement without accountability creates entitlement. So engagement, I've worked to give my kids really as much engagement as the world as possible. Like I really want the best for them. And we've had a lot of, success. And so, we hiked Kilimanjaro, we've traveled to Mexico. Like I want them to engage in the world. But if you are engaging, or if people are trying to engage you, if they give you much, right? Engagement without accountability creates entitlement and dependency. And so what's accountability? It's not like whose butt's on the line or like you have to have hardship. Accountability, the foundation of it is simply self-reflection. And so engaging folks without fostering self-reflection, without fostering people to mind their experiences and have some hardship and have to evolve some resiliency. That's what's happening. Is it's not a generation where they're just spoiled kids. It's a generation that we have lost some of this internal journey work because our parents didn't really teach it. And as you said, the school system, is limited right now. The internet has evolved so far beyond, kind of archaic school system. But what we tend to do from ego is we go, ain't it awful? Aren't these times awful? And aren't educators, ridiculously out of touch? As if we're entitled and we're like, well, they should have provided better. But upon self-reflection, it's like, yeah, these are tough times right now, but there are times.
Mm-hmm.
And so my reflection is not to critique, that's ego, but to say, one, what's my part in this? And how do I round out, my own education? So if all I learned in school was, the date the Constitution was signed and the clause that we cite a lot from the Constitution, the preamble about, we the people and, are all equal. And so we learn that. Don't be the victim of, that's a data point somebody joyfully gave you and tested you on. That's good. What do you need to build on? What I'm building on is I learned what the Constitution said. It's my job right now to go out and inquire in my world, get super curious and ask people what their experience has been like living under what the Constitution supposedly guaranteed. And so when I talk to Indigenous people or when I talk to people of color, and I'm like, what's your experience been with this whole, like, we're all created equal thing? Or if you identify as a female, or if you, have fluidity in the gender you move through the world with, right? Like, what's it like for you? So what a lot of us do when we're entitled is we get something beautiful, like somebody taught us the Constitution. and we discount it, and then we're disgruntled about it because it wasn't enough, instead of just thinking, oh my gosh, that is such a wonderful data point to start with. There's a constitution,
Mhm.
there's an election. What do I need? What other information do I need? But entitled people keep themselves isolated by adopting a victim mindset. So we usually do worse things to ourselves than was ever done to us. So let's say the education system I got was like, it was old and it was limited, and yeah. What I've done for 20 years to myself on social media is not question how old and limited my newsfeed is. So, and I expose myself 3 hours a day, according to my phone, to a really archaic, limited. So I'm mad about 18 years somebody else did to me. I've done this for 40 years, or probably social media, 15 years. So that's where the ego keeps us always as the innocent victim and the world as our villain.
Mhm.
And it's that piece that we lead to entitlement, where when we do the math, we're always one down, and other people are one up, and we believe we deserve to be one up. And the reality is there should be no one up, one down. We
Mhm.
should just be in the world. And so that's, for me, entitlement. But it frustrates me so much because I have 4 boys that are in whatever we're calling, it's not even millennials. Millennials are like 35, 40 years old with, many with a couple of kids. Like, people are like,
Right.
those darn millennials. I
Yeah.
always I always laugh because in a group of people that I spend some time with, there are some people who are really devout followers of Jesus. And they're like often complaining about the millennials. They're like, these darn millennials, and they want to stay in my company, and they're only 38. And I'm like, Jesus was like 33, and you follow every word he says. And they're like, oh, I'm like, people have wisdom the minute people have wisdom before they're conceived, because they're coming from, the ultimate source, and it's where we return to. And so even like babies have so much to teach us, and people who are completing their lives have so much to teach us. So, but
Right.
somebody said, because my whole team is millennials. Well, not even millennials, they're younger than that. My whole team, like the oldest person on my team is 32 years old, my entire team. And so a lot of people ask me about that, and they're like, gosh, aren't they really entitled and like hard to work with? And, they just, basically like they live in technology and they just want to game, and isn't gaming awful? I'm like, no. My employees, I want them to be good gamers, because if you look at what gamers do, gamers don't need you to train them. They don't need training, right?
Mhm.
They like download the game and they just pop right into it, and they aren't sensitive to feedback. They get killed and they're like, good to know. I gotta watch that corner. And
Right.
they work together as an international team. Like, my kids, it's like they're playing all together with people from Turkey and Greece and Iran. And as they're doing that, they've got texting going on with different cheats and codes, and it's like their process improving right as they're going. And there's just so many things where I'm like, no, I want people like that, because in my company, I want you to hear a podcast, and that leads you down the rabbit hole on Reddit, where you come and you go, we should use Patreon instead of charge. It's like, I want that.
Right.
So people who are labeling generations are actually naming it so they don't have to be exposed to it or evolved by it. And I would rather bring all of those folks into my life and stay curious and allow them to evolve me, so that I can just experience more of the world.
Mhm. Yeah, and it reminds me of like I hear like immigrants are a lot more grateful for everything because they come into America because they didn't have all the rights and everything they had over in their countries, so they appreciate it a lot more. So is it a entitlement, like a lack of appreciation or lack of respect for like those who have come before you? Or
You
like
know, I think it's not about what we have, because I personally think the world has enough resources that we could use it wisely without damaging the planet and feeding everybody and giving everybody, what they need. I just have this abundant mindset. There's enough. What happens for me is it's not just that people have too much or don't, it's the not taking space to go deeper with what we have so that it's satisfying, which relieves the craving of more. And so I don't know that we can stereotype that immigrants are more, grateful. I know in my life that whether I have a lot or a little, and I've been homeless and lived in a pup tent by a river, and I've had a lot. I know that it isn't what I have, it is the willingness to fully experience what I have. And right now, we've got people that are skimming, and rather than fully experiencing. Now, it's easier to fully experience what you have when you only have 12 things like Gandhi had, right? It's because, it's easier to focus. But I think the real piece is, my kids say, Mom, you can't hate us. You made us. Like, you raised us. So for my kids, instead of saying like, gosh, you need to be more grateful for what you have, I need to role model what that appreciation looks like. So when my son came over last night for dinner, it's dropping everything and just being fully present. And that gets contagious. My fully present with him, when he felt seen and heard and loved up, like he was able to be fully present and be fully present with his partner. And so I think there's lack of gratitude, certainly, but I think it's bigger than that. It's about the pause. It's about
right. I guess the question's like, worst case scenario is, maybe this person is entitled. How do they get out of that entitlement? Maybe they don't even realize that they're entitled, but is there something they can do to change?
Yeah, they can. So if you're, noticing that most of the problems you have are what we call first world problems, like, oh, somebody spilled juice on my Louis bag. Like, if you're noticing as you go through a day, like what you're freaked out about is what I would call a first world problem. Don't shame yourself. You don't need a violent approach into this. Like, you're not a bad person. You're a person that's just a bit out of alignment and balance. And so there's different things you can do. But the easiest thing to do is widen your experience of life, because if your mind is starting to get closed, which is what entitlement's about, it's hard to open your mind back up. But what's connected to your mind is your heart. It's easier if you go kind of at this a different direction. And so what I would say is, if you're feeling or finding yourself acting entitled, and you can start getting that insight. And the way you get the insight is self-observation and noticing. Notice, like, go back and read your own Instagram feed and notice what you evidently value. Go back and review your day and the words that came out of your mouth, and just notice if that really represents who you are. And then go break your own heart open, because what you're lacking if you're entitled isn't always appreciation. It's mostly compassion, that I have things other people don't have. And so I encourage people, whether it be travel, don't just stay at the swanky hotel, go out into the streets and meet the people. And, don't rush by somebody who's homeless if it's not offensive to them. I mean, they have boundaries and rights too, to not be disturbed no matter where they live. But if it's not, when the opportunity comes up, as it does many times, somebody says, hey, can you spare some change? Don't just say yes or no. Like, go deep in that experience. Go, I might be able to. What's going on in your life? Help me understand. if you are feeling entitled or somebody's telling you entitled, replace the word entitled and just go, my view's gotten pretty narrow.
Mm-hmm.
And go do things that will widen your view. And, a lot of things that will widen your view is it can even be reading like great literature or listening to podcasts you don't usually listen to, or, just physically being present in a different part of town.
Right, like
Right.
gaining different perspectives or putting yourself in other people's shoes, or,
Yeah,
getting out of your comfort zone.
totally. I, have noticed this year how racism is wired in me. And so I just started to notice, like, I'm bristling because somebody's following me. And is it different if it's a person of color or if that person's white? And if so, what's going on with me and what do I need? I need more exposure. And so, unfortunately, our city is still segregated economically. And so it's like when I'm going to go, pick up delivery someplace, like drive the extra 20 minutes and pick up delivery from an awesome restaurant I've heard about in a completely different area. And then while there, just fully immerse myself in the experience and notice what comes up. We have to do more self-study. We've got to have more. It's funny because entitled people, what they really need is more self-interest. They really do need more self-interest. And I think that's where we can help each other.
Yeah, and your first two books are on reality-based. I think one's reality-based, what is it, management or leadership?
Leadership, yeah. And then reality-based rules of the workplace.
Yeah, so what do you mean by the term reality-based?
So many folks lead from a place where we're in ego and we have a distorted view of reality. And so a lot of leadership is about how to represent my people and go fight for them and change reality for them and get them all that they need and make their way easier. And it almost is like, it's coddling people. It's almost building fragility and entitlement. And for me, coming from a therapist background, I'm like, okay, first of all, we have to stop the argument with reality. What most people came to me as their leader is to change reality. I'm like, well, that in the short term is like 100% no-go. What if we worked with you to grow you so that you evolved and had new skill sets so that you could walk through a current reality like this more skillfully and more effectively and more peacefully, more happily? Like, I could go out and work on reality, but here's what the research says. Your current happiness has only 10% to do with your circumstances. 50% you were kind of born with. It's like your set point. 40% has to do with your level of accountability while you walk through these circumstances. So even if I could change the whole world, I'm only going to get you 10% happier as a leader, or I can help grow you in healthy ways to move through the world. And then you're going to pick up 40%. That's where we need to focus. And so I wrote the first book because so many leaders I felt were way off track and over-rotated on trying to buy people's love and clean up the mess of reality, instead of help people understand in the short term, this is our reality. So let's be evolved by it. Let's rise above it. Let's, work given this situation. That's what really brings our innovation out. And then we're in a higher level of consciousness. We're in a place that we can design and curate a new future situation. But we can't sit here as victims and wish reality were different and wait for it to change. So as I wrote that book for leaders came to me and they said, one of the things in the book I said is, work with the willing. Don't go after the person who's unwilling. Like, so many leaders are trying to engage everybody. I just engage the willing, and we break the curve, and then it's attraction, not promotion. So they said, well, how do we find the willing, or how do people get willing? So I wrote the second book for individual contributors. They're like reality-based rules of the workplace, so that people understood and could stop this argument with reality. There's just like, once you learn 5 rules how the world works, you'll quit that argument. It's the argument you'll lose like only 100% of the time. So then I went on to write No Ego, and coming up next fall is a book called Life's Messy, Live Happy, that goes beyond No Ego to how to live this stuff personally. So it's kind of come full circle to starting as a counselor. I'm back to doing a lot of counseling in the form of books and podcasts.
Yeah, that's awesome. Is there a book or a philosophy or ideal that kind of seeded what you believe, that kind of a thread in all your books or the way you think?
Sure. So definitely my education on like human behavior and human behavior economics. So, in really understanding how the world works. So anything that, is like Daniel Pink or Seth Godin or like the Freakonomics guys, like that influenced me. But I would tell you, people are like, what business books do you read? Because I coach and train and develop, and our company does the same. And I don't really read that many business books. So I have human behavior information. But what I do a lot of reading is poetry and spiritual teachers, because I think these are universal principles that just need me or someone like me to apply to today's situation. So I love Byron Katie. She's at thework.com. And she will teach you how your ego works and how it messes with you. And she will teach you ways to disconnect. I think and the whole world loves Eckhart Tolle. Michael Singer, The Untethered Soul. Like there's just so many beautiful books out there. I'm really changed by literature and poetry. So David White, Mary Oliver, Rumi. I literally sit in a chair and read poetry out loud. I sound like a big nerd, but it really, poetry like gives words to our human experience, and it's not all esoteric and profound. It's something I would encourage everybody to do. And there's so many good poets out there. On Being podcast has like on poetry or something, and they introduce you to like these short poems if you're a beginner. If you're not a beginner, you'll love it. But for beginners, they introduce you to these short poems, and then they have a little bit of kind of a, let's help you make meaning of this, and kind of a little bit of translation. I would encourage it for everybody.
Do you ever get into writing poetry yourself?
Here's what's so funny. So like my first 3 books I wrote basically like a term paper. I have expertise in this area, so I'm going to like just translate it on paper.
Right. Here's my bullet points, examples.
Exactly. So then people are like, Cy, how do you live this on the daily? Like what you preach at work helped me at work, but helped me even more at home. Like, how'd you learn this stuff? Well, now this book has me like in the creative writing process, because I have to really reflect on my experience, not my knowledge, my experience, and really go back and pinpoint. So to the poetry question, I've always wished maybe I could be a poet. And so I would try and think and write poetry. Bizarrely enough, what has happened while I'm digging deep and I'm writing kind of a life story is while I'm walking at night and integrating, I walk miles and miles. What's coming out of me is poetry. Like I literally, it's funny you asked this question. I just came home 2 nights ago, and a poem, not lyrics, not rhyming, like this poem just poured out of me about when you are truly loved by somebody, you are left with the message that you are enough, that we're enough, that we have enough. And so this poem about enough just like poured out. And so I think I might be becoming a poet. I would love that.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I think that's a great message. And I think the creative process is so different, and it really brings the ego to the forefront, and you have to deal with that battle. And so I think, so I write music or write blogs. And so it's always, you're in that dialogue with your ego, like, oh no, that's not good enough, or and it's a battle of like, well, if the song's not good, that means that I'm not good
Uh-huh.
or something. And so I think it's always this struggle going on internally. And so when people can, you know, be vulnerable and put themselves out there and, you know, follow their passions or follow their dreams, no matter what, then it's a beautiful thing. And so,
Totally. And the practice, whether it's meditation, however you do that, for me, it's kind of walking and just losing the day. Anything you can do that suspends ego really makes room for the creative process. And I find what you just said was so profound. I find that when I have writer's block, it's because I'm trying to write, express the creative side, and edit at the same time. So when I
mhm.
have writer's block, I think of a line and I'm like, then my ego sensor comes in and goes, well, that's not it. And so I never get anything out on paper. And so another writer teacher I love, Anne Lamott, she wrote a book called Bird by Bird about the writing process. And she just says, no editing while you're writing, just write a crappy first draft, just total crap on paper. Don't even think about what you're writing. Just puke it all out and then later come back and do the editing. And that to me, whenever I'm stuck, and this will help some of your creative listeners, they probably already know this, they're like, duh, but I just separate out my editing from my creating because those two things can't happen in the same space. We have to create space for creating and then create space for our gentle editing process. And I would tell you the book, and I won't name it, that I thought was crap. Like I made my deadline. Like I was so sick of writing this book, which I get with every book. I'm like, screw it. I made my deadline and I'm not going to get out of bed when it launches and the book is crap, is the book everyone loves. Because it wasn't about me. It's not about what I need to write. It's about what people need to hear. And so I always get nervous when my books are launching. And my mentor said, Cy, you answer the call and you are the channel and you put it on paper, your ideas and then things that come. Once that book is published, it's none of your business. What people do with it, how much it sells, whether people like it, isn't even your business. And so she's like, never check your numbers, just, cash your royalty check, never, go out and like read reviews, like, because my commitment is to put it out there. In the big crowdsource, like I think our life right now is like a big, Google search. In the crowdsource, I'm not here to say I know the answer and I should be the top rated, answer to that question. My purpose in life is that I want to be an awesome data point in the crowdsource. So as you're looking, some of you will resonate with me and others, some of you will resonate with somebody else. I just want to have done my part by putting it out there, searchable for others to find. And what they do with it, that's their evolution and that's their touch on taking something that came from imagination and there really isn't anything new in my opinion and got put on paper. It's their job then to take it the next chapter or the next rendition. So
That's beautiful. I just want to thank you, Cy, for being that awesome data point for people to go look at.
You're welcome.
And making the decision to push the conversation farther. You can either tear down things or build up things, and I think you've chosen to help people and increase the quality of their life internally and externally, whether it's in their life or their business. And so I want to thank you for all that you've done.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk with your listeners.
Yeah, where can people find you at online?
So anywhere at Cy Wakeman, CYWAKEMAN, and my podcast is called No Ego. And if you're really loving this stuff, You gotta search for it because Apple keeps limiting us, but go clear back to season 1 and it will take you through all the basic principles.
Awesome. Thanks, Cy.
You bet. Thank you.